Hoping everybody's in now and you can hear me. I have my eye on the chat. And yeah, I won't miss your messages here. But welcome to the course. I'm really excited. We're basically going to be looking at some well test techniques in Whitson Plus, and specifically we'll be looking at CPG, DQI, and DFITs. My name is Venkata Teja Chavali. I usually go by this little name in the double quotes here, Teja. That's what most of my friends and family go by. But if you want to use it for any legal purposes, it would be the full name over there. And if we can't get time to answer any questions here today, or if I missed your question by mistake in the chat, feel free to reach out on email. My email is chavali@whitson.com, and it's basically my last name at whitson.com. And yeah, so much for this little message I typed here for you. But let's get started here now. So mainly, the course goal today is going to be refreshing or developing some well testing, interference, key concepts, and theory. We'll be looking at CPG, which stands for Chow Pressure Group. We'll also look at DQI, which is Devon Quantification of Interference, and both of those are pressure interference tests. Pretty easy to do, inexpensive to kind of look at, and I'll show you how we should absolutely look at those techniques, especially if we have bottom hole pressure gauges and things like that. The last one, DFIT, diagnostic fracture injection test, is slightly different from these pressure interference tests we look at, where we'll only look at one well and a test done on that well to predict the minimum principal stress and permeability, pore pressure, and some other parameters over there. Okay, so all of that said and done, it's mostly the same techniques that we talked about last year, but we've got some additional features here this time, and we've been hearing all that feedback that's been coming in. It's mostly resampling at different levels, resampling and smoothing at different levels within the software. It's highlighting different portions of the data to make it easier to pick some slopes, etc. We also included truncating as one of the features because that's been requested a lot in order to analyze multi-well interference tests. And along with a few dots, I've added DFIT tangent method and PTA with a smiley. And that's primarily because the tangent method and the pressure transient analysis are actually part of the new release. That new release should be right around the corner and hopefully should be on your computers or pushed over to you by the cloud one of these weekends, and you should have this pretty soon. So I thought I could take a quick detour, show you some of those features, but specifically in terms of the pressure transient analysis, we won't be talking much about that in this course. Hopefully next year I'll have a colleague and maybe we'll dive into PTA separately. But right now, the idea is to show you all the new features, get some new feedback, and then go back on to working on that and get you some more new features by the time you're working on your next problem, right? For anybody who's already been through this training or is new to Whitson or new to this training in general, we've got hands-on learning. We'll use 3 wells as an example, and we'll work through that on Whitson Plus with those techniques and learn something new today. Okay. So that's the goal. Mainly for everybody who's new in the software or getting in for the first time. Let me just remind you where we'll be working through. So we'll be working through this section right at the bottom, right? So we're going to be in the well testing arena. We'll of course create our own projects, add those wells, and then crunch through the analysis all the way to the end. And the idea here is effectively focusing on these 3 techniques because all of the others will be covered in either different courses or irrelevant to this exercise. And just as a reminder, I just added how the panel looked like when I delivered the course last year on the left. And you see there's not a lot of changes, but if anybody's curious, we have a new PNRDCA function that you can explore. It's been used widely for forecasting purposes. If you look at the multi-well analysis, that section has kind of expanded with the multi-well gas lift optimization, group forecasting, etc. And well testing, it looks like it's the same, but soon enough you'll see another option there for PTA or pressure transient analysis, and that should be great as well. But today's agenda, we'll try to cover CPG, DQI, and DFIT. We'll focus on what it is, why we do it, how we do it, and we'll have at least one well to play around with as an exercise to figure out how to work the CPG analysis in Whitson Plus. Okay, so yeah, that's primarily the agenda. Ultimately, we'll be working through most of what we cover in the well test certificate exam. You can kind of go through the manual and go into certification, and within that, you'll find all of these different certifications for different workflows. Some may be relevant to you, some may be relevant to someone else, but effectively, I find them relevant, or I find them all relevant. So, it might be useful to just go through them all and kind of master whatever you can and could do on Whitson Plus, right? So, yeah, feel free to reach out and with the project and things like that, and we'll definitely give you the certificate later. Okay. And let me just remind everybody of the access. I know we're going to be using the same domain here, just so we can jump in, help you whenever needed. Some folks may or may not have Whitson access, but effectively we'll all work on courses.whitson.com. So I need you to go to courses.whitson.com, and just once you get there, you should see a login page that looks a lot like this, right? So most of you with Whitson in your companies would probably have just these two buttons, and you typically would go in through Office 365. You get authenticated through your Office account. And so if your company subscribes to Whitson, most likely you should have access to Whitson.com. It usually is your company name.whitson.com. But for this exercise, we'll be using courses.whitson.com. That's just a domain we use for training purposes. So most of the work that we'll be working through today, you should be able to follow along on your own domain as well. Okay, after the course if needed. So the username is going to be your email, and the password is going to be Whitson Well Test 2025 pound. Right. So it's going to be the small Whitson Well Test in capital, Well Test, Wheel Test, however you want to see it, but effectively Whitson Well Test 2025 hashtag or pound. And if anybody needs this again, feel free to reach out on chat, and I can drop that on the chat as well. So that's pretty much basics. If you can't log in, or if you need help, please feel free to reach out to support@whitson.com. And as always, we'll jump in to help and get started. Okay. All right. Just a few maintenance tips, right? And legacy slides, so don't blame me. But effectively, we like a zoomed out version of your screen. So just the software is designed for larger screens. So most often when you log in for the first time, you might have 100% zoom. If you zoom out to about 50% or 67%, even 80%, you should be just fine, where all the buttons, all the layout would be exactly as designed. Otherwise, you might have some buttons kind of leaking off to the next row or things like that. But either way, I think I'll show you what you might run into, but zooming out should always help. If you need more real estate, screen real estate, and you want this browser rows to disappear, you can press F11 on your computer, and that should basically get rid of those banners at the top, right? And then once you're in, there's a hamburger menu on the left that would basically then show you the menu options. Okay. And yep, the project should be empty. I will definitely make my field company wide, and I just wanted to give you a quick round of how that looks like as well. So for all those who were able to log in, let me actually make this field company wide, and then you should all be able to see it. Okay. So you see how this one is private at the moment. I can go in here, click that, and go to company wide, and that's it. So now you should be seeing a field called well tests in Whitson, November 2025. And that should basically be the sandbox where we'll all create our own projects, we'll upload data, and we'll get to work on that. So let me know if you can get to this project. Yes. But I'll jump back onto the slides, and definitely more to cover on that. So before we jump into the software, I just wanted to highlight that you have a navigation panel. All of those modules will be there. And then on there, you'll have the software hierarchy, which is kind of like fields, projects, wells, and scenarios. And effectively, You can switch between the wells. You can go through each well and look into the data. You have wherever you are, your address bar will be right on the top. So which field are you in? Which project are you in? And as well as the well that you're in. Okay. And within that, we look at scenarios, etc. Okay. And both of those options should give you the analysis page, and that should give you more header information. You change units right up top over there with where the degrees Fahrenheit is, and anything that you see on Whitson will be encapsulated inside these cards, and you can basically see some summary information and open it and edit some of that information. Okay. In at any point, if you do get stuck and you need some assistance, feel free to press that feedback icon right up top on the top right corner. And once you do, you'll be given this form to fill out. And as soon as you fill out this form and click save, which is kind of straightforward, you don't have to attach anything. It gives us, ability to kind of look into exactly where you're stuck and help you out immediately. Okay. So as always, we're super proud of the support that we have in the company, and so our clients are really happy with how we support them as well. So kudos to the team over here, and then we can continue. And if you need anything, do let us know. Okay. At any point, you can click the question mark icon on the top right next to your name, and that should bring you to the user manual. So you should be able to access more theory or content that you need, or maybe some detailed explanation into one or two of these options. You'll definitely find that there. All in all, it is a cloud-based software. So if you do find yourself stuck, or if you think something's not working, a quick refresh shortcut is Control plus R or Control Shift and R, both of which should just refresh your screen, bring you the latest and greatest data from the database, and kind of use that. Okay, so it could happen due to bad connection. Sometimes the browser is stuck. Sometimes I have too many tabs open and it does that to me. But hopefully we don't run into any of that. And feel free to reach out if there's anything there. Okay, with that, I think what we'll do is we'll jump into the theory. The way I thought about going about this is we'll work through CPG, upload some wells, and basically work through the CPG analysis. And then we'll work through the DQI theory and work through the DQI analysis on another well. And then if time permits, we'll try to see if we can analyze the CPG well with the DQI technique and the DQI well with the CPG technique, both of which should be 100% possible to do. And in practice, most likely you should try to do both of them because they're similar. Okay. So, all right, let's start with the CPG, right? And the main thing I want to address why we use CPG, or what is CPG useful for, is effectively it quantifies, at least qualitatively, a level of interference, right? So at the end of this analysis, if your CPG value is 0, then that would mean that there is absolutely no pressure interference. One well is not seeing the other well at all, right? If it's between 0 and 0.5, the inference is that the interference is weak, and that you know changes in wellbore 2 may not largely affect wellbore 1. And now when it comes to when this value, the CPG value that we calculate, goes higher and higher, so we're talking about any value that's over 0.5 and up to 0.8, we can't call it negligible, we can't call it weak. It is more of a moderate impact. We would see some difference in the pressure drawdown on this well if it was between 0.5 and 0.8. We might also see some level of production loss because of that interference. And so there's a CPG value that might be between 0.5 and 0.8, and that inference has to be a moderate interference. Okay. Now, if that CPG value goes higher than that, about 0.8 to 1, it will indicate a strong interference between the two wells. Okay. So just to summarize, the CPG value is an index. It might go from 0 to 1, but depending on how you set up your problem, you may end up with some artifacts like CPG values greater than 1, or some natural phenomenon like the flow regime changing in one of the wells. That might also lead to some funny looking CPG values. But for the most part, CPG is a value that you would measure between two wells. So wellbore one, wellbore two, and effectively once you have measured a CPG value by way of reading pressures from one well while while performing an action on the second well, what we can calculate is a CPG value. Okay. And effectively, if you have a higher fracture overlap, the impact of that shut in and drawdown felt at that monitoring well is higher, right? So as I mentioned, we are working on one well and monitoring using another well. And depending on the amount of fracture overlap, you might have a higher or lower CPG value and hence a higher or lower production impact. Okay. So effectively, you might see me use the term MPI a few times here and there, and that is effectively the average of the CPG values. Okay, so effectively, if I take the average of CPG values for one day, then I get to call that an MPI, and higher the magnitude of that value, higher the pressure interference, and that's our inference from the CPG tests, right? So any questions on why we do the CPG tests? Awesome. Yeah. If that's clear, let me just explain what it is, right? So effectively, it's CPG analysis is used to detect and quantify pressure interference. We're talking always between a well pair. So you have an offset well and a monitoring well in this pair. Okay. So the monitoring well is where you might have your gauge set up, and that gauge is constantly reading pressures. Maybe the monitoring well is also shut in, or maybe the monitoring well is being produced. So either case, you always have pressures being read from before you do anything to the offset well. Okay. One of those conditions is that you have stabilized flows in the monitoring well or a stabilized shut-in in the monitoring well, and then you work on your offset. So because the idea is you want to measure the impact of one well over another, and effectively you're doing that um, at least in one direction when you work on the offset well and continue monitoring your uh, pressure gauges in the monitoring well. That said, right, what it does is that it considers that BHP trend in the monitoring well before and after the offset well is put on production or taken offline. Does that make sense? So you've got an offset well and you've got a monitoring well. The monitoring well has stabilized pressures, so you can draw a line through that. But effectively, you have an offset well that you're trying to measure how does that impact the monitoring well. And so what action you need to do is either the well needs to go offline or the well needs to come online, right? And both of which should cause a slight deviation in the pressures that you observe in the monitoring well. And you're effectively using this deviation to establish this magnitude of pressure interference. Awesome. Yeah, I thought I heard a question there, but feel free to just ask a question if you can unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, and I'll be able to read it. So I'll try to go through that immediately. Okay. But yeah, so effectively, if I'm able to measure pressures before and after, and I'm able to measure that change because of my offset well event, right, then the corresponding derivative slope after the offset well comes online is basically given as delta P over 2 times delta P derivative, right? Now, delta P is effectively the the changes with respect to the prior trend, and 2 times the delta P derivative is if I take the derivative of those changes and effectively construct this value, which is effectively the pressure difference itself, divided by twice the pressure difference derivative, then that is a good measure to generate a magnitude of pressure interference. Okay, so we're calculating CPG as follows, and this comes from work from Chu et al. And in 2017, 2018, I think I might have the paper number in here somewhere. But effectively, they integrated CPG analysis into well interference test program. I think a lot of this came from Pioneer as well. So they used this to guide well spacing, completion volumes, and started grading the results of stacked and staggered well patterns. So beyond just being used for flow regime, or beyond just being used for pressure interference, it was initially also used for flow regime identification in a lot of wells, because the delta P over the twice the delta P derivative also yields an identification of linear flow versus boundary dominated flow or bilinear flow, etc. Okay, so starting from there, we basically started using that technique, or that derivative, the CPG derivative as it is called, into pressure interference tests. And effectively, what we're doing with the Chow Pressure Group in the context of interference tests is simply measuring what would you expect the pressures to do before you had any offset well event, and how did the pressures change after you acted on that offset well, right? And if you work with that data and start constructing this value, you tend to see the CPG value plateau at some future point, and that would be the measure of the pressure interference that one well can see from the other. So in this case, the monitoring well feels from the offset well. Okay. All right. So a lot of talk, a lot of words. Let me show you a quick example of how you would design a test, right? So let's say that let's say you have a source well, you have a few monitoring wells, you have gauges in the monitoring wells, and effectively you have, as you're producing, what you're implicitly doing is you're sending transient signals in the reservoir that, if assuming you have enough communication between the source and the monitoring well, can be felt at the monitoring well, right? So what we're doing is we're running one or several wells. Uh, we're running downhole gauges. We can then monitor fall off and obtain stable conditions. So we're talking about this part of the test where my monitoring well has to be in a stable flow condition where I can confidently predict the pressure decline going forward. And then the idea is that the source or the offset wells have to be systematically put on production, right? The reason why systematically takes a lot of emphasis over there is primarily because when you put multiple wells online on production, what you want to do is you want to offset them or stagger them just enough so you're able to independently assess the impact of each well on the monitoring well. Make sense? So let's say that this plot here shows you the pressures that you read from one of the monitoring wells here, and you have had stable trend before, and then where that green line is, the offset well online, that's where one of your wells is coming online, right? So once that well comes online, what happens is you start to see a deviation in that observed trend, and you start to see an increase in the decline for the pressures in the monitoring well, right? And you can reliably say that that is because of the source well or the offset well, because you know exactly when the offset well came online, and you've been tracking stabilized pressure from prior to that point, and you can also see that reality has given you slightly different set of pressures. So effectively, this difference in the delta P is an effect of bringing that offset well online. And what you're really doing is you're trying to quantify this difference in order to get that CPG value. And I think I see a question in the chat from Celine, I think. But effectively, she or he asks, how is the magnitude of rate change accounted for in the CPG? Bigger rate changes will lead to more delta P for the same level of connection. I wish I could say that. So going back to what I spoke about earlier, right? So we were looking at Chow pressure groups and Chow pressure group analysis, and what we defined is a qualitative range of numbers where you would be worried or not, depending on how you look at it, right? So one of the drawbacks with the CPG analysis is that a zero point 0.6 or a zero point 0.7 or a zero point 0.8 in one well, and you get the same number in another well, may mean that they're both, um, you know, moderately interfering, but that does not really quantify the amount of interference, if you will. And for that, we'll somewhat look at we look at the DQI technique. I like that a little bit better, but I think I would use both hand in hand and kind of see how that trends. Ideally, what I would look for is confirmation. So maybe if the CPG values are higher, I would expect a higher impact to production from the DQI analysis. And yes, one asks if the magnitude of CPG can vary as a function of time of monitoring. And yes, 100%. We see that all the time, and we'll see that effectively this pressure difference is not consistent in the sense that it is expected to plateau at some point, but what happens beyond that plateau is out beyond our control, because either of the wells, be it your offset well or your monitoring well, might run into flow regime changes, at which point your prior trend or this trend is not completely attributed to that offset well. So it's kind of almost on the evaluator's eye, I would say, as to weed out those problems from the real message in the data set. Okay. All right. So primarily what we're doing is we're measuring pressures. We're reading those intently while we're working on the other wells, and we're monitoring that deviation from stable conditions. So we're effectively trying to quantify as a value what that CPG value would be. Now, this is for a drawdown CPG example. Let me show you what would happen if you had a build-up CPG example, right? So let's say both of your monitoring well and source well is shut in, or effectively you could have it the other way around, where you have a source well that's basically coming online and the monitoring well is shut in. Okay, so once that monitoring well is shut in, you have build-up pressures in the monitoring well. So that's what you're tracking here on the left. And then at some point, you might have an offset well coming online. So you're effectively seeing this red vertical line here. And as soon as that well comes online, you see that even though you were expected to build up in pressures along this top line, your actual pressures, they built up according to this bottom line, because they also have interference mixed in with them. Same problem, or the same route as the drawdown tests, but effectively we're trying to track how those pressures changed once we started acting on the offset wells. That being said, any questions at this point on how you would do drawdown tests versus build-up tests, etc.?
Are there pros and cons to doing the drawdown versus the build-up, like one over the other, or are they just samesies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So pros and cons to doing the drawdown versus the build-up. I think I would prefer the build-up, primarily because the build-up signals are cleaner. So effectively, you could be looking at a build-up, and if that interference is strong enough, that build-up trend will change quite a bit. But effectively, if that interference is not as strong, then you might have no difference at all. That on the drawdown side might be slightly complicated due to, flow issues or other, spikes in the bottom hole pressures that you might pick up along with the signal. So, and also the flow regime changes. I mean, buildups also go through changes in the slope. But that being said, the buildup slopes are easier to track than the drawdown slopes, I believe. Does that answer your
Thank you.
question? Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, have question.
Yeah. Yeah.
How accurately you can apply this CPG technique if you have just wellhead pressure instead of bottom hole pressure?
You can, but I think it would involve some sort of an assumption, right? So if I did not have bottom hole pressure gauges, and I only had wellhead pressures, I think the main assumptions that I would have to make is wellbore configuration. If I can get that, the rates, if I can get those during that drawdown period, then I can calculate bottom hole pressures from those wellhead pressures, right? And I can potentially use those. But the only issue with that is that you see a lot of these interference effects are kind of the wellbore storage and interference effects kind of go hand in hand. So effectively, if you're seeing a reduced rate because of the reduction in pressure due to the interference, like in a drawdown case, let's say this is your decline versus this being your decline, yeah, that part of that might be masked by just wellbore storage and things like that, I believe. So there's a slight bit of disconnect between the wellhead and the bottom hole, but if you can grab your wellhead pressures and then and then back calculate the bottom hole pressures for that drawdown period. Hopefully that can still be useful. And assuming you have consistently similar measurements on other monitoring wells, and so you're working with wellhead pressures everywhere, I think those numbers, since we're working with a qualitative comparison, should still be useful. And yes, I think I see another question from Hernan on with wells on production. Do you extrapolate the trend with a power law function? And with buildup, would it be the same? Yes. So for the buildup and the drawdown, we're using that power law function, and effectively, be it the tire pressure trend, when you extrapolate that for the drawdown, it would look like that, and for the buildup, it would extrapolate like that as well. Okay. And how long should these tests be run? I'm not entirely sure, but I think the standard practice is reporting CPG values at the end of 1 day or 2 days at most. But I think CPG at the end of 24 hours is pretty typical. Yeah, yeah. There's a quick comment there on doing this early time or immediately after the frac job, and you would probably see pressure leaking off into the formation in the monitoring well while shut in, so it would impact your interpretation. So it depends on how you want to look at it. So he makes a great point there. So you might have instances where you have a monitoring well, and because of how recently the well was fracked, you might see a a drawdown or a decline trend, even if you have a build, even if you expect a build up because of the shut in. Yeah, I think there's one more question, and then maybe we can jump into the exercise itself and hopefully take more questions there. But there's a question on the pressure changes being observed several hours after the source well is put on production. Should that be the reference for the gray broken line and not the actual POP time? So the gray broken line, or maybe what they're talking about is this, where do you set this vertical line? Is effectively, I would set it still at the time and date when my offset well was put on production. The fact that these pressure changes are observed several hours after the source well was put on production is also a good information that I would take into account when I'm measuring the CPG value, if that makes sense. Because we're simply working off the derivatives, we're measuring and giving reporting values at the end of 1 day. If that pressure interference never reached the well for like maybe 4 hours, 5 hours, I think that would be important information to keep in the data set. Okay? Because it directly relates to how quickly the pressure transient is being able to move between the two wells. So a delay there would mean that the travel time between the two wells is pretty slow. All right, so we'll jump into the exercise here quickly, but here are the main steps that we'll kind of go through, right? So we'll basically condition the data, select the time when the well is put on production. We'll fit that initial pressure trend. So we're talking about fitting this yellow line. We'll also set up this gray vertical line, the broken dashed line that we were talking about earlier. And then that gives us the right to extrapolate that pressure trend, same power law. So when it comes to fitting that initial pressure trend, we're fitting it with a power law, a constant and an exponent. And effectively that's extrapolated into the future. And these differences, the difference between the yellow line and the black line, give rise to the delta P plot here. And we can calculate the derivative with respect to time as delta P dash. Once we have both of those, we can actually take a ratio. Half of that ratio is effectively your CPG value. Okay, so you see at very early time, yes, it may take its time to stabilize. It may stabilize and then start to plateau at some point, and it may also increase. But effectively, you want to cap that analysis off at some time and kind of report them all at the same time, if you will. So most typically what I've seen is people like to look at CPG values at 24 hours. So that's going to be at your 1 mark, and 2, which is basically your 2 days after the source well or the offset well is put on production. Okay, time after POP. So we calculate that. We calculate the delta P derivative. We calculate CPG and MPI. That's going to be pretty much how we go about this analysis. Okay. All right. So in terms of the variables, I know it might be confusing once we jump into the software, but I'll just show you what variables we have to play around with. So we have truncation options now. So effectively, if you have multi-well tests, I'll show you how that might look like. And then you can basically use the truncate option to set up a start and an end time for your test. You can then set up your POP time. This is your prior trend fit. So this is the constant, this is the exponent. You have a Bourdais derivative in terms of calculating the delta P dash. The options are Bourdais, weighted central difference. I think the other one is just a central difference, but you have a window size on the Bourdais derivative, and effectively you can control that. And there's another resampling method here that you can use to resample within this truncate bounds to basically show you more or less points, or depending on how noisy that data is. Ultimately, you can also set up a quick note here for yourself. So you might have done this test both ways, and effectively you might measure something that's like this number, well 1 to well 2. From well 2 to well 1, it will be slightly different, but most likely the assumption is that you want to be pretty close in terms of the same wells being tested. Awesome. And then the last option, and kind of slightly less used, would be to use the pressure integral. And the only reason I say slightly less used is because let's say you have pressure data coming from a gauge, that's usually pretty smooth, and you can kind of remove the noise pretty easily or smooth through that data pretty easily. Even there, you might need an integral just to make the curve a lot more smoother. But especially when it comes to wellhead pressures being translated to bottom hole pressures and using those for the CPG analysis, maybe the integral helps quite a bit because it integrates over that noise and kind of tries to get you a smoother interpretation line here. So yeah, my idea is that if you're using the pressure integral for some of the wells, it might help to kind of switch back and forth between both and see if the pressure integral really offers more value in terms of getting a cleaner CPG pick. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much it. There's one last concept. I remember how I spoke about how was also used for flow regime diagnostics, and primarily the way that this was done is the CPG value, instead of being calculated just on the delta P, it would be calculated on rate normalized pressures. So you had the rate normalized pressure, you had the rate normalized pressure derivative, and the half of that slope would effectively give you the CPG derivative in that case, and that CPG derivative was used for flow regime identification, right? Because effectively, whatever that slope is, the inverse of whatever that slope is, 2 times that slope would effectively become the inverse of the CPG value. Okay, so effectively, there's multiple ways in which you can get your CPG pick. Either you draw a line through an average of what these values look like, or you can set up that slope to align with your pressure trend right at the end, or wherever you feel like indicates the highest level of interference, and see how that looks like on the plot. So both of these plots should be interlinked. So we should be good on that end. All right. And if there's no questions, I'll quickly wrap up with why or the value of this CPG analysis. And the main reason why you would do that is it's not just something that you would do on a well by well basis. It's something you do on pairs of wells. So eventually you have multiple pairs of wells being tested. If you design that test perfectly, then you have enough monitoring wells and enough space in the sequence to accommodate multiple wells in that test. So you're getting multiple well pairs for measuring the CPG value. And once you start stacking those together and comparing those values against increasing unit oil recovery, you might notice that you may be right here on the left side, where you might be aiming for a low interference, which also might be yielding a low unit recovery, leading to more wells per section. Or you might be high up on the right side, where you might have a higher magnitude of pressure interference, but at the same time, on those wells, your unit oil recovery is higher. And so, at least from a lot of the work that was done and the literature that drives some of this from some of the features we've implemented in this technique, they also show how the magnitude of pressure interference was also related to the completion volume or the amount of proppant they pumped per cluster. And effectively, what they're looking at is there's a sweet spot in terms of the MPI that might yield the highest EURs. Okay, so effectively, all of this ties back to how well we're draining the rock. And so, is there a good answer for like what value of CPG is good? There probably isn't, but once you start looking at a lot of these well pairs, and you start plotting those well pairs as a function of different measurable outcomes like the oil recovery, EURs, completion volume that you pumped into it, etc., you start to see a picture, and effectively it adds value in terms of calibrating frac models. It refines those expectations for contacted OIP, especially when you're looking at infill wells versus parent wells versus half-pounded wells, etc. And effectively allows you to appraise sweet spots and maybe rethink what your completion volume would be, right? The last point, I think we already talked about this piece, is effectively higher MPI, and there's a point of diminishing returns for the same completion volume. So you need to find that and then hopefully incorporate some of this into your economic models. All right. So with that, super short test. I think we'll come back to this slide, but I'll quickly jump into the software here, right? Is everybody with me? So if you're with me, then effectively where you are is courses.whitson.com. You were able to see a whole lot of fields or maybe none, but effectively we'll be working in the well tests in Whitson November 2025 field. So if you can see this, go ahead and click that and give me a thumbs up or something on the chat here if you're on the same page. Okay. Oh yeah, I can zoom into my window. All right. Is that better?
Teja, I don't see mine is blank under fields.
Oh, yours is blank under fields.
Yeah,
Double
so
check.
courses.whitson.com/fields.
Yeah, and then this is actually company-wide.
Go to fields.
Oh, maybe you might have to refresh. Can you try Control Shift R or try this button? You see this hard refresh button?
Okay. Oh yeah, now I see it. Okay.
Perfect, perfect. I might have just done that and then you beat me to it. So you logged in, so it has the list, but it doesn't have this one. So yeah, typically pressing hard refresh is like a way of kicking the software and asking it to get you the latest and greatest data from the database.
Got it. Thanks.
All right. So yeah, we're working with this project or this field, well tests in Whitson November 2025. And what I want you to do is add your own project here and give it a name. So I typically just do my name, I think whatever else, but something like that should be easy. I think we have some folks who did refresh, but still nothing. Is there any chance you might have done this? Can you try doing this? The reload button within the software. It's called a hard refresh. What I've been told it does is that it tells the browser to ignore anything it has on this page, like cookies or cache or things like that, and fetches information from the server, nothing else.
Could you show again how you added a new project?
Oh yeah, for sure. So if you're in the projects, right, on the top right, you should see a button called Add Project. Yeah, just to let you know that the projects you create might be created as private. So you want to create your own project over here, Add Project. So that way, the difference is anything that's in the main, everybody in the company can see, or anybody with access to this field can see. So if you have your own Whitson subscription, usually what you might see in the main, or maybe they renamed it to daily, but effectively you might have all your daily production data from all your wells sitting in here. Okay. What I'm asking you to do is create another project. So you're making your own little sandbox. I called mine Teja_well test training. And so once I have that, I have a private project for myself and only I can see it. Nobody else, even if they have access to this field. Okay. And just for everybody's sake, what I'll do is I'll make my project company-wide, but you don't have to do the same. Okay. Just so everybody has something to look at. So you've got that. You can see my project. in case you can't, just press hard refresh over here, top right, and you should be able to see my project. Awesome. I think I'll assume we are good to go. And if anybody still has any issues, feel free to let us know in the chat. I do have my eye on it, so it should be fine. So yeah, moving on. So we've got everybody has their own project, right? Teja well test training or whatever your name underscore well test training, and you're working with a blank project at this point, and you have nothing to see here. And now what you'll do is you'll click the mass upload button, and you see what you're seeing in this dialog box is a whole set of interfaces that we do accept data from. So if you have nothing, if your data is in an Excel sheet, you want to use the Whitson template. Kind of, it's a quick and easy template that you fill out. You basically have a sheet for all the well headers. You have a sheet for all the production data. You also have a sheet for all the wellbore configuration. So this would be a pretty neat way to get all of the different pieces in to the software. Uh, but if not, you might have data sets that you pulled from Enerdeck, or you might have data sets you pulled from Prism, etc. Right? And so for those, you just want to export over there. It will give you two files. Those files you just need to drag and drop into this Prism interface here, and that should do the job for you. Uploading header data, uploading monthly production, etc. All of that really useful for decline curve analysis, type well stuff, but we're not getting into that. So we'll skip over to well test, right? All the way over to well test. And over here, the advantage is that we still use the same Whitson template. So if you have built one for this screen, you already have one for the well test screen. You primarily have to just drop that in here. The only advantage is that you get this option to resample. And I'll show you how that looks like really quickly, but let me actually upload a few wells here, okay? So you see, when you slide over to the examples section under mass upload, example section, you're looking at all of these different data sets that we've already put into neat templates that you can either download. Let me just do that. And then, or you can directly upload without really having to download anything. So you see this data set has 11 wells in the Eagleford, 15 wells in Haynesville, 27 wells in the Marcellus, and then depending on the workflow that you're interested in or the certificate that you might be doing, all of those certificates, all of the input data needed for those certificates will be in the example section. So all you need to do is open the manual page, come in here, kind of click the wells that you need for that certificate and get started. Okay, so for this case, what we're doing is we're uploading the well test certificate wells. So I'll click upload here, and we'll go through the 3 wells. So what that does is it uploads 3 wells. I'll quickly hard refresh here, but I have all the data I need. CPG, we'll work through CPG on that one. We'll work through DQI on this one, and we'll work through DFITs on this one. Now, let me show you quickly what the well test interface does differently. That's not the same as the Whitson interface here, right? So what I'm doing here is as soon as I drop my file into this box, I get the options to resample. Now, one of the feedbacks that we've received and something that I've kind of seen consistently with every operator is all of these pressure measurements are way more frequent than we probably need for any of these tests. So we're talking 2-day tests. If you measure every single second, you're looking at a lot of data that you might not really need. So you can totally use linear downsampling, where you're effectively saying, hey, I'm not really particular. I have way too much data anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter a percentage of the data to keep. And so a 10% would mean that I throw out 9 in every 10 rows. So effectively, I have a 10x reduction in the data set. And so I'm looking at 266 rows. Now, I'm not going to resample this file, but effectively, I know you have all of these different files with more than 500,000 rows for one single test, be it DFIT, DQI, CPG, all of those. So effectively, what you could do is you could use the well test interface and drop that mass upload file there. Let me quickly show you what that mass upload file looks like. And so you're looking at, I have no data to give it for the well headers. So all of this is blank. These are just names I used to initialize the well. But really why I'm doing that is because I want to tie it back to the production data in this sheet. And all I have is a badly formatted time column and basically this column, which is, yeah, if you look at this one, this probably makes more sense. But you see, I've got data every 5 minutes, and I've loaded up all those pressures in the PWF column. The PWF column is the measured gauge pressure, is usually meant for measured gauge pressures or measured bottom hole pressures, if you will. So you might want to add that. Or if you have wellhead pressures, slightly more complicated, slightly more requirements, but you might want to add that there. Bring your deviation surveys, wellbore data, like the configurations, add that, calculate bottom hole pressures. All in all, if you have your hands on all of this information, pretty easy to input and send it in. Okay, so yeah, that's what the input data set looks like. Just time versus pressures, or pressures versus time, and I've stacked all the wells one after another. So I'm looking at CPG, DFIT, DQI, all in one file. Okay, and this file exactly is what gets uploaded when I basically click examples, well test certificate, upload. The one new feature that we added here is this resampling option. And just like within the feature, you have two options to resample. So if you're going for a straightforward remove 9 in every 10 rows kind of a reduction, then this is your best bet, probably the easiest to do. The other one is effectively an adaptive resampling, where effectively you may enter a few rows that you want to preserve as is, but from that point on, you can specify a pressure threshold. So maybe we have that as 1 psi or 2 psi. So it'll only keep points that are at least 2 psi apart. So that's the difference. So between adaptive resampling and linear downsampling, linear is just straightforward, where it'll chop through the data set and give you 10% of the data. Adaptive resampling is one where you're not strictly specifying how many rows to delete or how many rows to preserve, but you're definitely telling it to preserve every change in pressure that's greater than 2 psi. So it'll look at the y-axis, kind of walk through the pressures and keep only the rows that have at least a 2 psi difference. So linear resampling, probably your best bet. Easy to just give it a percentage and shrink that down. Pretty recently, I had somebody with over 500,000 rows, and even we just had to shrink it down to 3%, and it still looked like we lost nothing once we uploaded that file. Okay, so we've got all our wells in. Is anybody having any issues with that?
Why would you want to get rid of so much of your data whenever, like, all the papers and such talk about sampling at like 1 to 2 minute frequencies and getting, that clarity of data so that you can see even the small pressure interference changes?
No, solid question. I guess that would depend on what your data looks like or the quality. Yeah, most pressure interference data sets may recommend 1 to 2 minute intervals, but a lot of the measurements might be at a much higher frequency, so every second or every 5 seconds. So you see, you're already going for at least a 12x order reduction when you're going from every 5 seconds to about 60 seconds, right? Minute. And then on top of that, the reason why you would want to do that is because the CPG and DQI, all of them are techniques that are really dependent on the derivatives, right? So if you have measurement, the noise in the measurement, that might drive some of your consecutive points off, kicking that derivative up. So effectively, if the derivatives are blowing up, then I would definitely go for a higher degree of resampling. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And in all probability, you are looking at these tests and you're measuring at least 2 days of that shut-in. So even if you have a minute or 2 minute frequency in your data set, you're still drawing the inference from a general trend, which usually does not require all of that resolution. But you can feel free to go ahead and upload more than that if you need. But I think on the software side, just going back to like what the software can handle, I think I've seen data sets of up to 40,000 and 50,000 rows, not, and the software does not seem to have any issues. Maybe a few, it's not the most fun experience because you will see it stutter a bit as you cross that 50,000 mark. But anything beyond that might be more than you need. All right, I'll jump straight into CPG. I know we lost some time earlier today, but looking at the CPG well, this is that scenarios page I was talking about. So if you had any header information for any of your daily production wells, this actually is a very informative page, and you kind of get a sense of the well location and general identifier information, reservoir properties, completion properties, etc. And then if you were into rate transient analysis, maybe you would work through all of these sections, get a sense of your production data, work through decline curve, bottom hole, analytical RTA, and things like that. But for us, we're focusing on the well testing piece, so we'll jump straight to Chow Pressure Group. I just wanted to pause for a second here, show you what that production data plot looks like, and you see we have a measurement or a test that lasted about 2.5 days. We had something happen on the 19th, sometime in the evening when that well came online. And so I have that POP date handy, and I'm looking at that pressure trend or that prior pressure trend. So, but this is just production data. Okay, I'll reset my zoom and I'll jump into the Chow Pressure Group. Is everybody with me? What I'm looking at is the Chow Pressure Group section for the CPG well.
Venkat, I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So first, what's the recommended resolution that is ideal for CPG, and does it differ between other interference tests that we're reviewing today?
Yeah.
Is this something we'll have to do these manual uploads every time, or if we already have all the projects set up on a company-wide basis, how easy it is to just use the data that's already being fed in without using the manual spreadsheet upload?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So on that first question, the recommended resolution for the Chow Pressure Group and the DQI, I believe that, given that these are 2-day tests and mainly what you're trying to infer is this change or that deviation between the prior and the post, you see how even if I throw out half the data, right, I might still have the same inference. Do you see that? And now this I know is a very idealistic case where I know the pressure data is pretty smooth, but why would you not expect a smooth pressure trend? So the idea is, yes, it can be less frequent than a minute or 2 minutes, I believe, but at the same time, you don't want to throw out all the way everything where you're smoothing over that trend itself. Does that make sense?
So you could say 1 minute minimum is the requirement.
No, 1 minute would be the maximum required, in my opinion. But otherwise, if you have that resolution, and if you have that resolution early time, and then if you have that resolution right around where you have the POP, maybe that is everything you need. But usually what happens is you might have, pressure measurements every second for 2 days, which is probably the overkill. Does that make sense? I don't have a recommendation as such, but I think that 1 minute data versus 5 minute data versus 10 minute data, it would look pretty much similar unless you have sharp changes in pressure.
But 1 minute is as coarse as you would recommend.
I think the course test would definitely be more than 1 minute. I think I would be as brazen as to say every hour, every half an hour, every 15 minutes. And then I would walk back from there. Does that make sense? Because in this 2-day test, I've basically eliminated 90% of that. And I can still see where my POP roughly was and what my prior pressure trend likely was. Does that make sense? And for the DFIT, I think the frequency on that, I would prefer having a higher frequency on a DFIT test than a CPG or a DQI test. Does that make sense? Because on a DFIT, especially right after I shut in the injection, I'm looking for pressure drops. I'm looking for changes in pressure. I would definitely vote for a higher frequency on that data set than a Chow Pressure Group data set. Okay. And then I think you had a second question there. The second question being, can we have this integrated in one of the projects that your company might have? And that's 100% viable option. I just haven't seen a lot of these data sets being maintained in a central location or a storehouse. It feels like, yes, there are these measurements, but they're mixed in with some ESP measurements, and they might also not be centralized or might be individual reports here and there. But if that's not an issue, 100%, I think we can integrate kind of anything into the software and into a separate project. All right, I'll jump into this, right? I'll go back to one and effectively saying a linear resampling of one would mean use 100% of the data. So I'm using 100% of the data. And I did two things there really quickly while I was talking to Yuri. So what I did is I moved my POP line. That's probably step one. Step one is you set up your POP time to when you know you had your offset well come online. So for this case, I know it's 19th and probably somewhere around the 5 p.m. mark, 5:30. Okay. So let's say that that is my POP time, right? Now, if I look at my yellow line, that is basically the prior pressure trend. So if I zoom into this section here, all right, the way I did that is any plot on Whitson Plus, you can basically click wherever you have a plus icon, you can click and that draws a box. If you go diagonally, it draws a box. If you go vertically downwards, it just pans the whole thing and snaps to that y-axis. Okay. But what I did is I drew a box and I went, okay. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to adjust my prior pressure trend. By the way, once you're in the zoomed in version, if you can't get a hold of this end of the line, click on reset slope. It readjusts this yellow line to make sure it's still in view within the plot and you can grab hold of both ends here. What I'm doing next is I'm primarily moving that line slightly and I'm trying to see if there's a sense of a better fit. All right, so you see what I'm doing here? I'm basically ignoring some of these early time points as not being representative of a stabilized flow regime. Make sense? What I can also do is I can truncate that piece and I can say, hey, that little piece over there, I don't want to accept it. So maybe what I can do is I can move this forward. And you see what I did that? Well, as soon as I do that, what it'll do is it'll save the data within these two bounds as data set for this CPG analysis. Make sense? So once I do that, that is my fit and that is my pressure trend. Maybe I might have to adjust it slightly, but again, it's aligning really well on my Cartesian plot and it's aligning really well on my log-log plot. Make sense? The constant and exponent values that I have here is 11.65 and 1.06 along with that POP time. Now, if you had a build-up, you would effectively toggle this on. And if you had extremely noisy data sets, then you would toggle this on. So what that does, and it completely fails for this data set because it's relatively super smooth, is it effectively smooths the data over a moving average window. Okay. So for data sets where you have measurement noise or noise attributed to the gauge, not a reservoir effect, what you would do is you would use this, set up a really small filter span, and then kind of go work through that data and see if you can take those kinks out. Okay. So in this case, I don't think I need to use any of that. And basically I have a good handle on my prior pressure trend. Okay. This derivative and effectively that prior pressure trend is acting on this pressure drop. So effectively the blue lines that you're seeing is your pressure difference compared to the yellow line, your prior trend. And what you're trying to do is also calculate a derivative with respect to that. The pressure divided by twice its derivative becomes your CPG values here. So you see if I block this off to go from 0 to 1, then what you're looking at is an average right around this point here. Okay. And I'll move this along there. And you see effectively what I'm looking at is a CPG value of 0.6. Let me quickly refresh. And that 0.6 is also reflected in this slope here. And the next thing I would do is I would try to see if that aligns with the pressure trend I'm seeing after where I have interference. Okay.
Venkata, what if the second plot, the Chow pressure plot, it's not like flat and going up, it's just showing, it's just increasing up and to the right.
It's just increasing up into the right. Yeah, that's definitely something that I've seen. And it can totally happen. So effectively, can you imagine a scenario where let's say that this is my monitoring well, right? These are the pressures in my monitoring well. So now let's say that because of that well coming online, let's say that this monitoring well started to feel the barriers or that stagnation between those wells, then what happens is the flow regime in this well somewhat changes. Does that make sense? And so when that changes, you might have a slightly different slope here. And so now the slope or the difference that you're seeing with respect to that prior trend is the compounded effect of two reasons. One is the offset well coming online, and then the second thing is the flow regime change in its own its own depletion characteristics. Does that make sense? That immediately picks up this delta P here, and that increase in that delta P might be why you're seeing an increasing CPG value. I think.
I'm just trying to understand why my plot doesn't look the same as yours. Is there a step that?
Oh, is it the same data set? Oh, yeah, I think so. Are you
Yeah,
looking
no,
at the
just
same
let me
data
back to
set?
the
Oh, I thought you were talking about a different plot. But if you're looking at the same data set and if your plot is forever increasing to the right, I think I might know what might be going on. So you see, if I have a trend that's actually lower than that, 1 second, I think. Yeah, if my prior trend really is aligning more with the post trend, I could see that happening. You see? Because there are small changes that are happening in the delta P's here that are significant when you're comparing it just with the delta P between the prior and the reality. You see that as well? So it's I would definitely say that it is sensitive to how you set up that prior pressure trend. And so one of the options you do have is using a spray gun fit. So you could choose to fit only that section and see what that looks like. And hopefully you get closer and closer. But effectively, I've definitely a problem with even the smallest interference. So I'll show you one more reason why that could happen. Let's say that you practically had no difference in the prior and the post. Then you would be looking at something like this, right? Where your prior pressure trend was actually like that, and then you have a barely minimum amount of a drift because of that offset well. Then also you might run into such an issue where a low interference is kind of misinterpreted as a high interference because of this mathematical artifact. The other thing that I would also look at is this window size. So if that Bourdet derivative is using a 0.2, you might want to see if reducing that helps, because that'll make it calculate more often, and maybe you're seeing a plateau somewhere over there. But let me get back to my
All right, real quick.
interpretation.
So what if you, did have that example where it just continues to increase and increase? I'm sure you'll get to this, but where would you then put your horizontal line?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I see that and it's continuously increasing, if there's no plateau that I can put a finger on, then I would definitely try to see if there's any issues with my prior pressure trend, right? So you see this difference between the prior pressure trend is effectively what's causing really low differentials. You see less than 10 psi, and then that is causing even small changes to become amplified in the derivative. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this as well. So if that's what's happening, I would see if this prior pressure trend looks all right. And if it does, then I would see if the pressure difference is large enough to have a significant impact. And if not, then I would kind of settle with a lower CPG value here. Does that make sense?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, you want to basically constantly align the dash line or align this line to the trend that you're observing for most of the data. So you see, as soon as I align that with that, I'm looking at a CPG value that's actually really around 0.4, right? And then the question is, do I trust what's happening in this portion, right? So you see how I see a trend that's going down and then it's concaving up here somewhat, and that's what's causing this issue with the derivative. So I should be able to explain that, and if not, I would look for like other clues. Yeah, getting back to where I was, right? So if you had a data set like this, what you might do is you might just say, hey, at the end of one day, that's what my company wants me to report. At the end of one day, on an average, even if you assume this is part of the little bit of shock that you might imagine, but effectively, if I draw a line to say the average of these values, I think it would be somewhere there, or maybe as high as 0.6, right? So effectively, what I would note down here is all of it is qualitative, right? So at the end of the day, what I'm keen on is basically getting a range and seeing if the interference is expected to be moderate or high. Okay. For the low ones, I think it's going to be pretty obvious, and maybe we don't really need to work through it. But effectively, for the moderate ones, I think that's where it gets interesting. So I would make a note of that, see if I have a confirmation by going the other way, where maybe this well has always been producing. Maybe I can see the offset well if it has any gauges, or if I have other monitoring wells that can work through that connection. But that's pretty much it about the CPG. If you have multiple wells, what you would do is multiple wells being tested using the same gauge. What you would do is you would create a scenario here, call it test 2, and maybe that one you'll truncate differently. So maybe that one is basically a test that's only between this and this. Make sense? So you've got one test here that goes with that has an event over here. Maybe you've got another test here that has an event over here. And so you can truncate each of your scenarios differently. And oh, there's that slight difference I was talking about. But you see, there's always those things that could happen. And let's say you have multiple tests in the same data set, you can truncate that differently and switch between your different tests by switching between the scenarios. Awesome. I think that was it on the CPG well. Is there any questions that we might want to address? So super short test. I don't think we need to shut in for weeks here. The data is cost effective. You might already have gauges. So if you have gauges in any pad and you have a plan to take some wells offline, do some well testing, then I guess the only thing that you need to keep in mind is the sequence of that test, and just making sure you can separately measure those signals at the monitoring well. Now, infill wells that have been shut in are perfect candidates, typically less than 3 days, and effectively you can do a drawdown test, and the whole thing for the entire unit might be between 5 to 15 days. There's some additional references here, but feel free to let me know if you have any questions. If not, I was thinking maybe we could take a break for 5 minutes and get back to the DQI method. I really like this presentation because it talks a lot about what has worked and what has not worked, etc. The data frequency, a lot of the questions that we had earlier in the chat. Super fun presentation to go through. It's part of a previous knowledge sharing session, but let's get back in about 4 minutes, and we'll jump into the DQI part of the course, and then we'll wrap it up with DFIT and open up for questions. Okay, me 4 minutes now. Thank you. You can see me. Hope you can see my screen, and I'm back. I actually have a cup of coffee, so should be good. Maybe we'll give it 1 more minute and get started. All right, perfect. So if you're back with me, let's just go to the wells page, and within your project, you should have another well called the DQI example well. Right, so we'll be working through that. Let's get started here. So DQI, that's the next one that we'll cover. So we just covered CPG, the Chow Pressure Group. It measured the pressure difference compared to what you would expect without that offset well action or event, and simply uses that to predict what that level of interference could be, right? Devon Quantification of Interference goes one step ahead, where it actually thinks a little bit more about pressure propagation, how that would occur in porous media between 2 points, and tries to fit a model to it and add to that prediction. Okay. All right. Going back to why we do it again. So this one quantifies that production impact. It quantifies hydraulic diffusivity, and it also quantifies that fracture conductivity. Okay. So the three things that that differentiate the DQI from the CPG is that, number one, it moves beyond that qualitative measure and tries to quantify the literal production impact that you might see due to one well on another. It also gives you a measure of hydraulic diffusivity and fracture conductivity. As I mentioned before, we're actually fitting an analytical model to the pressure interference signals that we see in the monitoring well. So we're going one step beyond just measuring a prior trend and getting pressure differences to measuring the hydraulic diffusivity and fracture conductivity. DQI is effectively the procedure to interpret well-to-well interference and calculate the degree of production impact, right? So the DQI measures the degree of production impact. Higher the DQI, higher the degree of production impact, right? So on the cartoons to the left, you're basically seeing two scenarios. One is where you have two wells in both scenarios. You have a monitoring well and you have an offset well. And what you're looking at is effectively if you have a monitoring well and offset well that are offset or staggered by quite a bit of distance, that there's barely or no fractures overlapping, then what you're looking at is that in the monitoring well, you should ideally see no pressure response no matter what you do to the offset well. Make sense? So that's pretty much saying that the offset well is not impacted by, or the monitoring well is not impacted by the offset well at all. Okay. Similar scenario, let's imagine that the offset well is actually drilled quite close to the monitoring well. And now you have a pretty good degree of fracture system overlap, right? So now once you have that fracture system overlap, you know that the offset well has to impact the monitoring well. So when you run this test and you bring the offset well online, what you might see is that the monitoring well will start falling off. And this is true for CPG or DQI. It's just that the DQI offers more insight into fracture properties, completion quality, calculates a maximum possible drain fracture length as a function of the fluid properties as well. So we're not just limiting that decision to the pressure difference that we observe. We're actually going forward and calculating a maximum possible drain fracture length as a function of those fluid properties. Okay. And the result is basically we get a calculated degree of production impact. We get a dimensionless drainage length. And this is kind of directly used for strategizing on well spacing. Okay. So a dimensionless drainage length of 1 would indicate that you're draining exactly until the tip of your fracture half lengths. But higher than 1 would effectively mean that you're draining beyond those fracture tips. All right. Now, the main reason why we discussed DQI and CPG together, and I think it's a very good idea to do so, is because CPG has a few drawbacks, right? So we've kind of covered this, but just to take this point home, is that the CPG, since we're purely working with the pressure differences and the derivatives of those pressure differences, or basically how that pressure difference is changing, we're not really getting a quantitative estimate, but we are definitely getting a qualitative estimate, right? The problem with that is that the same value of CPG does not mean the same amount of production interference. So you take two wells in two well pairs in different areas in the same field, and maybe you have a CPG value of 0.6 on both of them or a 0.7 on both of them, which indicates moderate interference. You still might see that the same 0.6 produces a much more interfering pressure drop and higher production interference than the same 0.6 in another area. So the degree of production interference may differ, but the interference impact being moderate means that the pressures will change. Okay. Now it accounts for that shape of the pressure interference, does not account for the timing of the interference response or the variability of fluid and rock properties, right? So between two wells, you might have slightly different fluid properties that might yield a different drained length, etc. So effectively, a fracture half length that's 50 meters in one area does not mean that it's draining the same area as 50 meters in another area. Make sense? Because of the difference in the fluid and rock properties. Now, we also saw how the CPG values might actually keep going up or are sensitive to that prior pressure trend, sensitive to the noise, sensitive to the derivative window size, etc. So effectively, obtaining that stabilized CPG value might be difficult. There's anomalous diffusion, and for different formations, different test conditions, those CPG values start to lose meaning. But as long as the tests are consistent, you've used the same basis for fitting the prior pressure trend, you should still be able to use that for a qualitative comparison. And it also increases with time. As the flow regimes change, CPG may increase beyond that one value that we initially capped it at. So that's the point where you start ignoring that value. Okay. The advantage of the DQI over the CPG is effectively it is relatively robust to the differences in the drawdown schedule and non-linearities of fracture flow, because we are fitting an analytical model to it that also takes into account the non-linearity in that fracture flow. The second thing is that it relates those observations to fracture conductivity, which is a physical parameter that would be otherwise difficult to measure, if not for drawdown tests and rate transient analysis and maybe a few weeks of production data, right? It also provides us a framework. The analytical model also considers rock and fluid properties, and it gives us a framework as to how that pressure interference would change depending on the different settings. And so I really like the DQI method over the CPG method, but for something quick and easy and qualitative estimate between, say, a set of wells, I would go with CPG. If I have more time and I need to dig into this analysis and kind of get a sense of the different parameters impacting this interference, then I would kind of choose the DQI. All right. So I'll move on and effectively kind of dig into the details of how the DQI is or what it is and how it's done. So the DQI is this procedure to interpret well-to-well interference. It quantifies the hydraulic diffusivity and fracture conductivity and calculates the dimensionless drainage length, right? Now, this dimensionless drainage length is then used to estimate a parameter called the DPI, or the degree of production interference. And strictly, it's kind of defined as the production after 20 days of that offset well coming online minus the production that the well had before. And effectively, what you're looking at is how much does that production change before and after. Okay. Now that DPI can directly be linked to the magnitude of the change in production expected in an active well when the offset well is shut in. So the DPI is actually linked to a fractional production loss. And effectively, you can say that if you have a DPI of 1 or 100%, then the production rate should double. So if you have an offset well that you shut in and you have a DPI of 100%, then your 50 barrels should go up to 100 barrels once you have shut that well in. If you have a DPI of 0.1 or 10%, the production rate in the monitoring well should only increase by about 10% if you shut that offset well in. Thought I heard a question, but let me know if there's any questions on any of this, okay? But let's jump into the how, which is actually probably the most interesting part of how DQI does things differently compared to the CPG. And hopefully that makes it all the more clear about how different these techniques are, okay? All right. So now looking at this, right, these are pictures taken straight from the paper, I believe. And what we're looking at is effectively you will have a test, you'll have a prior pressure trend, and you'll have a post result. You effectively have delta P's, or the pressure differences, compared to the prior trend versus the actual. And those delta P's and its derivatives, the Bourdais derivative, is plotted on this plot, okay? And once we have that plot, we can actually fit the analytical model to predict what the pressure change would look like and to predict what the pressure derivative would look like given the alpha and the fracture conductivity. So the hydraulic diffusivity and the fracture conductivity, right? So for these values, for these input values, this is the pressure response we're seeing. And effectively, if my delta P matches with the delta P analytical, I'm in good shape. And that's when I would say, okay, I have a model fit with this response. Okay. And then what we do is we use the alpha and K terms to basically calculate the dimensionless drainage length, etc., and then get a sense of what the DPI is. So in short, in summary, it's effectively using the prior pressure trend and setting up POP. Then we have delta P and delta P derivative plots. Once we have those, we can autofit the analytical model, or we can manually adjust the alpha and K parameters until we get a match. Once we get a match, we basically use those parameters to infer the DPI. Now that's a pretty broad brushstroke on how it's actually done. But realistically, the analytical model that we're fitting is a one-dimensional diffusivity equation, right? We've seen this in some of our old textbooks. effectively what it says is that if you boil that diffusivity equation into a one-dimensional form, and then you try to predict the pressure at an offset distance y compared to a pressure at some point t, compared to the pressure at the same point at time zero, then this is the quality, this is the shape of that pressure change. And so if you can fit this model to the pressure change that we're observing, then we get a sense of what the model parameters could be, which are driven by alpha and K. Now, once we have K, it relates to the fracture conductivity, it relates to the fracture height, etc. So it gives us a sense of the how infinite or finitely conductive fractures we have. And also, it also gives us a sense of alpha, which is effectively the hydraulic diffusivity, or it also relates to the travel time between 2 points in the reservoir, right? So if the fluid molecules or the pressure transient, however you want to put it, if that transient is able to travel between 2 points really quickly, then I would imagine that the alpha value is really high. If that transient travels really slowly, then I would imagine that the alpha value is really low. Make sense? So if you have, it's like the speed limit on a freeway. So if you have a freeway and you have speed limits on the freeway, alpha is the speed limit on the pore throats. So effectively, a higher alpha would mean the pressure transient is able to move through point A to point B more quickly than a lower value of alpha, which means that it has some impedance, it has some resistance to that transfer. And those are exactly those cases where you might see a delayed response. I'll show you here in the next slide really quickly. But really what we're doing is this is the analytical model that we're fitting to those pressure differences. We're getting a sense of reservoir properties from there, and we're calculating a dimensionless drainage length that we can then associate the produced frackling to. Okay, so given the fracture conductivity, we can then calculate the L, which is the maximum possible drainage distance along the fracture, if hypothetically it was unbounded. And I have some modifications that the paper recommends for bounded or unbounded wells, and we look into that in a quick second here. But let me give you some intuitive sense of how those parameters dictate the analytical model. So this is a sensitivity of that model to the model parameters, right? So the alpha, it controls the diffusivity, and hence it controls the timing of the onset of pressure interference. So you see the plot on the left shows you the differences for differing alpha for the same K, right? So effectively what you're looking at is a higher alpha means that you effectively sense that change in pressure really quickly to the point where you are already looking at a pressure difference at time very close to zero. But if you have a very low alpha, then you might actually need a few hours before that pressure interference is actually felt at the monitoring well. Does that make sense? So effectively a lower alpha, you see how it picks up almost an hour after the offset well is actually put online. But if you had a pretty high alpha, then it actually starts off way at the beginning, and you're starting to see those pressure differences as soon as you make that event happen in the offset well. Okay. Now the K parameter, it actually controls the fracture conductivity. So depending on how conductive those fractures are between the two wells, the shape of the curve after the interference matters. So you see, if you have really low conductivity, fractures, or if you have a really low K value, then what you might see is that the shape is actually picking up, and it increases, the pressure difference increases really quickly. But if you have a pretty high K or conductive fractures, then what that would mean is that the pressure increase is actually gradual. Does that make sense? Because a low conductivity in the fractures would mean that your well bore in the monitoring well is actually pinched out from the formation. Does that make sense? The conductivity, that's what it does. It severs that connection between the well and the reservoir. And so if you have a severed connection between the well and the reservoir, very quickly you're going to see those pressures increase or change, differ compared to the prior trend in the monitoring well. But if you have a pretty high conductivity fractures between the two wells, then what you'll see is that shape gradually increases and differs in a lot of sense compared to the low conductivity. All right. Yeah. Any questions there on both of these plots? Super important. And I think I use this to gather an intuitive sense. And when I'm going through manually adjusting K and alpha, if I don't like the auto fit, then this really helps me kind of tune my data right into the model. Then lastly, what we did is once we have K and alpha, we calculated the maximum length that the well is seemingly draining, right? And once we have that value, we normalize it by the well spacing between the two wells, right? So if I have well spacing as Y, then the half well spacing would be Y by 2. And I'm normalizing the drained length by the half well spacing that I have between those two wells. And once I do that, I get a sense of what my dimensionless interference length is. And you see what we did, or what the authors of the paper did at Devon, is they basically ran a whole bunch of simulations with these well pairs, and they varied perm. They varied perm at different conductivities. They basically varied varied the spacing, they varied viscosity, they varied compressibility. They had all of these different simulations, and they saw that it was lining up along this line here. So they derived an empirical way to estimate the DPI given the LD itself. So thankfully, we don't have to run all of these simulations. What we have in the software is also that you can basically do your analysis, put your prior pressure trend, gather that extrapolation and generate the delta P's with respect to that prior pressure trend. Then we fit the analytical model to it. And once we fit those analytical models, we get a sense of what the alpha is and K is, etc. And once we get that, we compare that with the well spacing, compare that with the drained length, and we get an LD. Once we get an LD, that is plotted amongst all the simulations that we saw on the previous slide here. So you see all of these simulations are taken as measurements that we had in the paper as gray background points, and you can see where your test lies along those lines and see how that responds. All right, and now this is the summary slide, but I'll jump back into this, but maybe what we should do is jump back into the software and take DQI for a spin. Okay, so let's look at DQI. I hope everyone's following. I do see a question in the chat from Henry. Is there a way to know where along the lateral the interference is occurring? And that's a really good question. It's hard to know where along that lateral the interference is occurring because, as we mentioned, I'll go back to one of those slides. I actually really like it, and I'm looking at this one. So this one, right? You would say that all the fractures along this lateral are actually intersecting. So all along the lateral we have interference. But then again, this is a mental model. And the only thing that we're really measuring is this pressure drop. So what we're seeing is we're attributing this pressure drop to maybe how much impact we might have on production or pressures, but effectively we're not quantifying where along the lateral or how much portion of the lateral is going through this. So in reality, you might have a scenario where maybe one fracture is intersecting, but that is the dominant fracture in both the wells. And so you're in great communication, you are effectively short-circuited, right? So you're in great communication, even though 99% of the lateral is not intersecting, okay? And so, yeah, I don't know if I would use other techniques for that. Maybe for individual wells, maybe I would look at fractional RTA if that helps. But yeah, I don't think this data set alone would be able to quantify where along that lateral the pressures are interfering. Maybe some microseismic data could help. If you had microseismic, a scatter and you had a dominant fracture, maybe you could probably say, hey, the amount of interference is occurring from a portion in the lateral. Jumping back into the exercise, right? So the DQI, one of the things we need to do for the DQI well is just so in case people can follow. So I'm back in the wells page. Once I'm in the wells page, we did the CPG analysis on the CPG well. Next, we're doing the DQI analysis on the DQI well. Okay. Now on this one, what we'll do is we'll quickly initialize the PVT. Let's call it 1000 GOR kind of a well, simple black oil well. That let's just say that defines the fluid properties that we need to use in the DQI module. So when you go to DQI, it should already be up and running. If you haven't done the PVT step, you might see a message here that says, hey, you're missing a PVT initialization, go back and run the PVT initialization, right? And the main thing that it is doing is it's bringing in the fluid viscosities for the matrix and the fracture. And based on the initialization of PVT, you might see that changes. Okay, is everybody with me? So again, I'll do the same steps. I'll set up my POP time. I know exactly when that is, and that would be somewhere exactly here. So you see, I've got April 3rd, 2020 at around 8:40, right? So at 8:40 in the morning on April 3rd, we basically brought a well online, and that's what we're seeing here. So we've got a prior pressure trend, and we've got this. Next, what I'll do is I'll basically set up my prior pressure trend, and let me just use the lasso fit for that. So if I do this, I select the portion that I'm most confident about in terms of fitting my prior pressure trend. I can lasso that data, and you see how that gets highlighted in the gray. And I can always reset slope, make sure that yellow line extends. I can zoom out and reset slope and make sure that yellow line extends again. And you see I'm probably pretty good on that prior pressure trend. I'm looking at a constant of 3.3 and an exponent of 1.07. And so you see this difference is what I'm plotting over here. Does that make sense? So the blue line is effectively a function of the difference between the yellow line and the black line. So if I modify my prior pressure trend, I can change how the yellow line is extrapolated. That effectively changes how my delta P's are calculated. The next thing we did is basically once we have those delta P's, we have delta P dash, which is effectively the derivative on that delta P. And what I would like to do is you see the derivative function here. Go in here and see the different options you have. So you have Bordet derivative, the weighted central difference. I'll show you how that looks like. You see, it's more continuous. It definitely goes all the way to the end. The central difference step size, you can reduce to get more noise in the derivative because you're basically using every single point adjacent to it for calculating the derivatives, or you can increase the span and make it a lot more smooth. Okay. So that's my derivative. And you'll see this option in the CPG feature as well, the DQI feature as well, potentially in the DFIT feature as well. But what we recommend is using the Bordet derivative, simple, easy, clean, and that window size, that's definitely up to you. But a 0.2 seems like a good default that we added in the software. But if you'd like, you can also go lower, make it 0.1. That basically allows it to extend a little bit towards the end, but effectively you see there are some derivatives still missing because a window size of 0.1 doesn't justify calculating derivatives right at the end because we don't have any points over here. Okay, so don't be surprised if this derivative ends slightly before when your data ends. That's primarily a function of the Bordet derivative and the window size that you've chosen. So if I have a 0.5 there instead of a 0.2, you'll see that I have a lot more truncation. I've truncated a whole half log cycle out. And so that's why it won't calculate derivatives for the last half log cycle. And there's probably tricks to getting around that. It's just that all of them almost always introduce artifacts. So if you have any ideas on extending that to the end, let us know. But for now, we've kind of set it to not calculate because we don't have the right span on the other side. So going with a 0.1 might be helpful, right? And then what you can also do is then start to see what the model and the model predicted and derivative looks like. Okay, that's not a fitted model. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click the auto fit button here. So you want to click the auto fit button, and what that effectively did is it ran through the algorithm and adjusted alpha and k until it met with a good match. And by a good match, I mean the alignment of the delta P analytical with the delta P from the test. And I can use the derivatives as a second comparison. And you see the models also predicting the derivative really well. And it aligns with that pretty well as well. I usually get a question here on which part of the data should I align, right? So I see that my analytical model predicts this portion really well. What if I wanted to really align to this portion, right? So what I would do is I would use the lasso fit again and tell the software that I want to focus purely on that portion, right? What happened then? My K parameter changed, my diffusivity dropped, and that's the value I have for diffusivity now. And just one more thing before we jump into more analysis, but effectively you've got a total compressibility, you've got a rock compressibility, you've got all of those parameters set right, and you're looking at a 150 in terms of that alpha value. And let's look at the derivatives, and the derivatives are still looking clean on there. So you see the amount of pressure interference that we're looking at. So we know that this well CPG value is bound to be high or closer to the 0.8, 0.7, 0.8 value that we qualitatively said was the threshold for between moderate to high interference. And then accordingly, what we did is we set up some more assumptions. So you see DQI needs more information than just the CPG. We initialized PBT with the fluids that we thought would be best approximated by that PBT initialization. And we also have assumptions here. So we've got 2 well DPI reported here, and that is turning out to be 0.97. Let's not even talk about the value yet. I just want to say that there's 2 different methods in which you would calculate DPI. For the most straightforward approach, or the approach that the DPI was written for, is a 2 well unbounded on the outside kind of scenario, right? But most often what you might have is a uniform spacing scenario. And there's a bit of an appendix in the paper, which also talks about how to take that 2 well DPI and then write that down for a uniform spacing DPI, okay? And when I do that, you'll see that this number goes out of bounds, and it's no longer a good sense of degree of production impact. But what's useful is this fractional production loss, which is effectively how much production do I expect to lose because of it being bounded or unbounded on either side. And you see how that changes between unbounded on the outside versus uniform spacing on the inside. So in this case, because we have a pretty high interference, we are getting a pretty high value of DPI and a pretty high fractional production loss number. But effectively what we're looking at is 2 different scenarios. Okay. A few other things that you would need to adjust is definitely the distance to the offset well, because this effectively normalizes the producing frac length to get you the dimensionless drainage length. And as you can see from this empirical relationship, as soon as your dimensionless interference length increases beyond 2 or even beyond 3, your DPI value starts going up. And effectively, we're looking at a dimensionless interference length of 8.25. That's why we have a pretty high DPI value here. When I hit auto fit, my fit doesn't look good. Is there an input I should change? Yeah, I think if that fit doesn't look good, there's few things you can do. So one is maybe you use the lasso fit or the spray gun fit options and really hone in that piece or that part of the data. If not, I would try to see if there's anything I can do with my prior pressure trend, and then see if I can get the pressures in a manner that I can match. Okay, slight changes in the prior pressure trend will cause slight differences here. And also, I would like you to focus on the data as well, like what is happening. So effectively, we're looking at one trend, maybe something's happening here, and then another trend here. So maybe this is not the best data set to do this with, but effectively, if you needed to hone in on a particular part of the pressure response, you can do that. And according to the paper, you should definitely focus on the first few hours or the first few hours after POP, and that's when you get a good sense of the alpha and the K. Okay. For me, I'm basically eyeing a general match. So I like how my match kind of predicted the onset pretty well. The onset matches when I have the actual pressures onsetting here as well, and it matches that late time trend. So I'm happy with my fit. All right. So now some more parameters here. So effectively, this is the total production rate that your offset well came online with. So effectively, you're looking at. So you see that one-dimensional diffusivity equation, we also had a Q term or the rate term in that. And the rate term in that equation refers to the impulse that you generated at that offset distance y. So that impulse is effectively your offset well and the rates that it came online with. But I believe for that duration of the test, you can assume a total production rate that's constant. Let's say that's 1,000. Let's say the distance to the offset well is about 1,000. In reality, I'm not too sure, but I think in reality it might be more or less. But you see how if you had a higher fracture half length, your yellow point moves further forward because your dimensionless interference length is now halved, right? I doubled that offset distance. I halved that dimensionless interference distance, and now I have an 82.5. On a uniform spacing side, I have a slightly lesser fractional production loss now compared to the 2-well slide. And you've got all the other parameters that you need. I usually keep these relative fracture permeabilities 1 and 1 because it effectively wants you to specify a mobility for the fluid. You know, do you think the fracture is moving faster than the fluids on the fracture are moving faster than the fluids in the matrix permeability? Yes, but is that driven by mobility or viscosity changes? Probably not. So that's why I leave those at 1. I have an estimate of the porosity and matrix permeability, but that's about it. I'm pretty much using that. And I think I have more questions here. So Pete, is the total production rate the peak production observed, or what value is that? Yeah, I think that would be, I would say, because we're looking at only hours after the event, it could be the peak production rate. But let's say that your rates went from 1,000 to 750 by say a day or two. I think I would use the average or a number that would be a good number to say that's the impulse we had at the offset well. Okay, so maybe a time weighted average could be a good value to use over here. But realistically, what you're trying to do is, if I jump into my slides really quickly and take you back to the equation, right? That equation is this one-dimensional diffusivity equation, and that equation demands that you know what that impulse was at that distance y. So if that impulse can be averaged out to a 1,000, I think you can do that. Okay, I hope that answers that question, Pete. Cool. Yeah, but I think that was pretty much it on the DPI. You have similar options. You've got Bordet derivatives. You've got, if it's a buildup, you kind of check this buildup sign on, and the pressures are extrapolated differently. Same for the CPG as well. You've got the same smoothing included in case your measured pressures are noisy. And you can also resample within this feature as well. So you see, you've got 2 levels at which you can resample data sets now. Either you can resample it right here at the very beginning, or you can resample it, again, once you've truncated that data set for the piece of the data set that you're looking at here, you can again resample and go down to 50% resolution on those as well. All right. Yeah. So now, if you go back and look at the values you have, now you're looking at a few different values that you can use to compare, right? Number 1 is the DPI, or the fractional production loss, if you want to take that with you and use that to see if you can make some rate estimates for this well pair when it comes to interference. You can also take the diffusivity back from this analysis and use that to compare the interwell connections. So if you have on a pad about 5 wells and you've had a test that basically measures the DQI for each of those well pairs, you can rank those tests by the diffusivity, and that would effectively get you very close to estimating that interwell connection or the impact, right? So higher diffusivity would mean any change you make on one well is felt on the other really quickly, versus the lower alpha value. Okay. A quick question on the producing frac length here. So the producing frac length, the sum of the fractures along the wellbore. No, I don't think this is the sum of the fractures along the wellbore. It is actually the producing frac length. We actually calculate that as a mass balance equation. So if you look at the calculation for the producing frac length, what we're doing is we're effectively balancing the flow in the fractures with the flow in the matrix. And effectively what we're saying is that if what goes in has to come out, then effectively my length has to be something that can support that. And if that length, if I can imagine that length to be this maximum drained length, then this would be how it would be calculated. Yeah, it does seem long compared to the well spacing. That is correct. And effectively, that's one of the reasons why we calculate a dimensionless drainage length once we have the producing length, right? So we normalize that with the half well spacing, and at least empirically, the equations we have seem to indicate that, even a dimensionless drainage length of 3 or 4 should still not be 100% in terms of the DPI, right? It takes almost a 7 or an 8 to be close to that 100% mark. So it's basically fitting the pressure response into a one-dimensional diffusivity equation mental model. And so you're not really taking this producing frac length as your XF, just by the way. It's just a way of measuring how much of the length that I need to support that flow divided by how much of that length is available as a half well spacing. And so but with that, they're basically trying to estimate the interlocking between the wells, if you will. Okay, interlocking of the drainage volumes. I think that kind of summarizes the DPI or the DQI framework, and it's pretty interesting. If you have measurements to do the CPG test, I think it's almost low-hanging fruit to just go ahead and do the DQI as well and see if those values of alpha, K, everything else that you can pull from here can be useful in your analysis. Okay, qualitative, quantitative, however you may interpret this. Okay, and these values may change over time. I know there's many presentations after this paper as well. That basically talk about the DPI and using the DQI to basically measure that interference between well pairs. But these are the authors for the original paper and a really good read, this one. So I kind of left it over there. I think we're at the last part of the training now. This is the DFIT module. Super interesting, slightly different from the previous two modules that we looked at. We looked at CPG and DQI. Both of those are pressure interference tests, right? So this one, on the other hand, is a slightly different test where you don't need to use well pairs. And in fact, it's the DFIT, diagnostic fracture injection test, is a whole test on its own that you do on one well, right? So let me jump straight into it and talk about the why, right? The main reason why you want to do it is because you want to estimate minimum principal stress. You want to estimate the pore pressure, and maybe if you're lucky, also get to estimate the permeability. So, but the low-hanging fruit, if you did do this analysis, is the minimum principal stress. Okay, so let me focus on that, and of course we'll cover the pore pressure and permeability pieces to it. But the minimum principal stress is an interesting value to estimate in different areas, in different wells, etc. Because effectively that is the pressure that you need to exceed in order to frack that formation. So think fracking multiple wells in a new area that you know little about. So you might have a sense of that minimum principal stress from a lot of the drilling activities that we might do. But this represents a way of getting the minimum principal stress by creating a small fracture and watching that close. Okay, so effectively, if we get our hands on something like that, what can we use that for? We can use that for exploration, development, drilling, avoids a whole slew of problems if we know what the minimum principal stress is. We can balance that mud weight accordingly and kind of prevent issues. Completion production, if we can estimate the net pressure within the fracture, we can then start to model some of this geometry, see how far it extends, etc. And it also helps us quantify or predict long-term sand production, compaction, subsidence, etc. Okay, pore pressure, super important, and primarily it can be used to characterize depletion across the field, right? It might be a new layer, it might be an offset location that's slightly further out in a different lease, but the same formation, etc. The depletion characteristics might be different. So the pore pressure is an interesting term that you can take back to some of your other wells and see if that initial pressure or that bottom hole pressure calculation at the very early time matches up with that pore pressure. and it helps you determine the extent of drainage, optimize that well spacing. And the problem with the DFITs is that the minimum principal stress and pore pressure are super important to estimate correctly, right? Once we have a good confidence estimation of both of these metrics, then we can start to think about calculating permeability, because the permeability not only takes a few more inputs beyond these two, but also relies heavily on the pore pressure, minimum principal stress, etc., to calculate net pressure in the fracture, and then uses those in some mass balance equations to basically get a sense of that permeability. So again, error propagates into more error sometimes. So if you have an error or low confidence estimates on both of these, I would highly recommend not running the permeability analysis or just leaving that at minimum principal stress or pore pressure. But if you were lucky enough to go through the entire workflow, then effectively you're looking at permeability, and you can take that and compare that with core-derived permeabilities. You can compare that with RTA-derived permeabilities. All of them are prone to assumptions and non-uniqueness, but I think on a large set of wells, I think they would be directionally similar. Okay, and these tests uniquely derive an in situ estimate of permeability that's a little less clouded by drawdown or other issues or core related issues. So I think it would be super important. I think one of the questions that comes up quite often is after an RTA analysis is, hey, do we have any DFITs in the area so we can start to get an anchor of what it could be, right? So optimal well spacing would be different for different permeabilities. That's one of the reasons why you wouldn't want to proceed with permeability calculation if you're not confident about these two, right? So what is it exactly? So we talked a lot about why we need to do DFITs and how easy it is or how difficult it is or what we need and what we can get. But realistically, what is it? So it's when do we do it? We do it pretty much prior to stimulating a formation volume. So imagine you're drilling a well, you tagged bottom, and you're in the formation. You haven't completed the well, but you need more information in the area, right? So what you do is you basically inject pure water, low volume, into the well, right? And what you're realistically doing is you're pressurizing that well bore along this line, and you're increasing the pressure with that really small volume, right? And at sufficient rate and at sufficient pressure, you're basically making a small fracture such that it breaks and creates a small fracture. You see that little bit of formation breakdown, and then you continue injecting at the same rate. Overall, you want to inject a very small volume so you're not creating too many fractures, or you're not forcing that leak off. But really what you're doing is creating a fracture, letting it extend, and then shutting it. So you follow that up with a shut-in, and then you monitor that pressure fall off during the shut-in. So you see that last piece, 4 to 5, is what we're interested in, where we have seen that pressure buildup, we've seen that breakdown, we've seen that extension, and then we've seen that shut-in, right? So from this point on, golden pressures that are actually, you're watching the pressures as they leak off from the fracture. You're watching some really interesting natural phenomena that may or may not happen, and you're trying to glean as much as you can from this fall off, okay? The way it falls off can tell you a lot about that minimum principal stress, that pore pressure, depending on how this tail looks like. And also you can get a sense of permeability, because all of this fall off is dictated by how easily the formation is accepting that leaked off fluid. Now, in terms of the costs, don't blame me on this one, but 15,000 to 75,000 is what I've heard. But this probably doesn't account for the production loss that you have as you're watching these pressures fall off. And maybe that's a blocker beyond the actual cost of doing the DFIT test. But yeah, it really depends on the duration of the test, how long you want to keep it shut in, BHP versus surface gauge, etc. But you can do this test with both BHP and surface pressures. Okay. Any questions on the broad operational items here? All right. So now there's a bit of a debate on this slide. I'm sorry for dragging you into it, and now you're going to be fully into it because we're going to have the tangent method in the software as well, just for folks who like to compare their results from some of the old analysis that they did. I know a lot of the softwares that use or have mini-frag DFITs or things like that still use the tangent stress estimate, and that is not a good idea according to some of the newer papers that have been written. So the paper that we've implemented in the software is the SPE 2019-123 procedure, or the fracture compliance method. So that procedure is effectively the compliance stress estimate. And what it recommends is effectively plotting a DPDG curve and using that to get a sense of what that contact pressure should be. The tangent method, which is what what we might have historically used and what some of the software still have, is this method where we plot the G times DPDG, just another curve that's a modification of this curve, and we effectively try to place a tangent to that curve. And wherever that tangent intersects the G times DPDG curve, we drop a perpendicular and see the pressures and read the pressures off of that. So, and that becomes our tangent stress estimate, or the minimum principal stress if you were to use that method. And so it kind of estimates a lower value. It might estimate a higher value if you use the compliance stress method. Both of these options have an effect on how much pressure you would imagine to be in the fracture. So effectively, it has an effect on how much permeability you calculate, right? So historically, what the authors of the SP 2019-123 paper have written is effectively that the tangent method is different compared to the compliance stress method, and using the older methods might be too low. Permeability could be really high, and effectively you might underestimate the effective fracture length, right? Now, the fracture compliance method, on the other hand, is actually more grounded in some of the older concepts that are used not just in our industry, but some of the other industries. So effectively, the DFIT analysis on Whitson by default will focus on the new fracture compliance method, okay? But in the software, and I might hopefully have the time to show you really quickly what the new release might look like, is that you simply have an option as a drop-down to pick between compliance and tangent. And accordingly, depending on your selection, the minimum principal stress you calculate will be used.
Yeah, just a question specifically on this important topic. What has Whitson been seeing in their experience working with clients based on the two perspectives? Is it more leaning to one versus the other, or?
Yeah, at least from my experience working with a lot of clients on a lot of these, is that everybody does like using the compliance compliance method workflows given out in this paper. And it definitely seems like a shift towards this technique. A lot of the clients that I do work with also have done the same estimations, but they've used the tangent stress estimate. So that's been interesting to see, because like those always end up being lower or different compared to what we have in the software.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, I think if you were to ask for my vote, I think I would stick with the compliance stress estimate method. I think I like how grounded it is to physical phenomena. I like how it is explained by the decomposition of this DPDG curve, and it really talks about what happens at different points of this. While this one, I think it has a lot of papers on it. It definitely has explanations for concave up versus concave down as it relates to fracture height recession and things like that. But yeah, I think I would pick the compliance stress estimate and go with that, unless I had some old research that I wanted to match numbers with. And in that case, I would probably try using this. Okay. And also it also depends on the formation. So the tangent stress estimate method, it's not wrong. It's just more suited for higher perm conventional well tests. Does that make sense? Like in the higher perm conventional wells, if you did the DFIT test, probably the tangent method and the compliance method would be very close. compared to really low permeability unconventional wells that we're looking at today.
Yeah, that makes sense based on just a normal leak-off behavior. You probably
Right.
have both of them converge. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, the
Thanks.
main reason is, yeah, it basically takes into account the fact that, hey, you're looking for that ideal nullity period where you have that pressure stabilization, and then you pick the minimum DPDG and get the contact pressure from there. I'll cover that. We'll look at this piece in a lot more detail in the next slide. Yeah, no problem. But mainly, I'll run through these 4 slides. It mainly talks about the 4 plots we use. So first plot that we'll use is bottom hole pressure versus time, just the raw data that we have. And we'll also plot rates, and we'll see both of them together. You want to ideally see this injection being constant. You have a little pressure test here. You also have a constant rate injection right here. You have this flat plateau, and then you have this drop, and that's when you shut in the well. You monitor these pressures, and you're looking for that fall off, right? You can then calculate the derivatives, the DPDG and the G times DPDG, and those are basically plotted in the orange and blue here, along with the pressures in black. And all of this is actually something you can do on Excel, but it's just a lot more involved and a lot more complicated to do on an Excel spreadsheet than on a software. So you will also need something like this, which is effectively your pressure fall off or effectively the pressure difference since you had the shut in, and you're looking for an afterflow where effectively all of the physical phenomena related to fractures have subsided, and now you're just leaking that pressure into the formation. You're looking for a linear or radial flow in this piece, right? And then depending on what kind of a flow regime you encounter at the end, called an afterflow. So you might have an afterflow impulse radial or impulse linear. So accordingly, you have a different time function here that you would use to extrapolate and get your pore pressure. Okay, that's about the plots that we typically use. And now just to jump into a few more equations before we jump into how to do it on the software. So we're mainly looking for Carter leak-off. So that's the fundamental physics governing fluid leak-off rate. It assumes that the pressure in the fracture remains constant. So that's why we see a straight line in the pressure versus G time plot. And that's the ideal nullity period or the Carter leak-off period that we look for. That helps us estimate the effective pressure, fracture contact pressure, and things like that. The G function and the H function, those are effectively superposition time functions for DFIT, where the G function has been laid out as proportional to leak-off rate. Okay, I'll show you how based on an equation in the next slide, but effectively that's what we'll use to estimate the SH mean. Okay, the minimum principal stress. Then you will also use the late time impulse flow solutions to capture the slopes, capture the pore pressure, and estimate permeability. So when you do one DFIT, you actually get a pre-closure permeability and a post-closure permeability. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But effectively, if I use that early time signature and I do not shut the well in long enough to see a late time flow, then I might use the pre-closure permeability estimate just from here. Okay. If I do have that late time afterflow and I can get a permeability estimate from there, I can use a slightly different technique, more classical in terms of well test literature, to get what the permeability would be given that I know the flow regime that it is in. Okay, so 2 ways to estimate permeability, all of that, the fundamental physics being the Carter leak-off. Okay, now the G function and H function, slightly involved slide, but just the way it's laid out, the leak-off rate is given with this equation. Okay, so the leak-off rate is directly proportional to G time, right? So effectively, the way G function is constructed, or the superposition time is constructed, is effectively it assumes a constant fracture pressure and effectively calculates G time like that. And then if I calculate the derivative dP by dG, then that's effectively the leak off as a function of G time, the change in the leak off as a function of G time, divided by the storage coefficient. Okay, so the dP dG by default is directly proportional to the leak off from the from the fracture. So the minimum DPDG may still be elevated due to near wellbore tortuosity. I'll talk about this in the next slide. But effectively, both these G function and H function are similar in the sense that they try to capture that the superposition time is effectively trying to mimic the leak off rate. And effectively, we're trying to lay out a superposition time that would be proportional to the leak off rate, and hence the derivative of the pressure with respect to G time will be proportional to this leak off rate. Okay. Same thing for the H function, except we're getting rid of this constant fracture pressure assumption, right? By using superposition. The deviation from Carter leak off is primarily because the pressure in the fracture is changing. And so the declining fracture pressure can be brought in like so. And if you use superposition for the changing pressures, you can then start to get a sense of the H time, which does not need to assume that we have constant fracture pressure, right? So it's a time convolution integral of one-dimensional constant pressure solution. It's primarily superposition and allows for the construction of relative stiffness plots for contact pressure. So sometimes if that DPDG plot does not look as ideal as expected, then you can use the H function and the stiffness plots to generate what that contact pressure would be. It's a lot of theory, but now jumping into a little bit of practical something. So this is a typical DFIT plot where you're looking at pressures. So my pressures are in black. They are declining throughout, okay? They might have a slight period where it's stabilizing. So I can draw a slope and extrapolate that to the y-axis, and that becomes my effective shut-in pressure. So even though you shut in at over 12,000 or 11,500 PSI, all of that dissipates really quickly, and that dissipation is a function of near wellbore tortuosity, okay? So your horizontal well is angled in one direction, your fractures might be angled in another direction. All of that initial leak off or the dissipation of energy occurs because all of that fluid is trying to readjust itself and, get to its most comfortable spot, right? Once it does, at this point, you can assume the fractures are fully open and that pressure in the fracture does not change much. So you have a constant or almost constant leak off rate right here, where you're hitting that minimum DPDG. And where you have that minimum and almost constant DPDG, you are having a straight line in the P versus G plot, right? That straight line extrapolation gives you effective ISIP. And from the point where it starts curving upward, what's happening is that the leak off rate is increasing. And the leak off rate is increasing because effectively that leak off rate is increasing because effectively the fracture walls are starting to close. Okay, so that's where you see some non-ideal or non-linearity in the pressure. So effectively, you see the pressure start to decline, and the DPDG curves upwards, and so you would use a rule of thumb of 10% from that minimum DPDG to get that fracture contact pressure, and heuristically, a 75 psi subtraction from that fracture contact pressure would put you very close to what the actual minimum principal stress is in that formation. Okay, so that's my pre-closure work. So I haven't looked at any after closure signatures. I'm only looking at the first few hours or maybe a first couple of days for this information. So not a long shut-in required for this piece, and what you get is a minimum principal stress. Okay. So this S shape that you're seeing is the ideal response that you want in your DFIT. The minimum has to be clearly defined, and then this upward increase is an indication of fracture closure. And effectively, you see you're going through fracture closure. And once you have fractures completely closed, again, you have constant pressure in the fracture, and you start to look at some afterflow signals. All right, now this is the late time impulse flow solution. So effectively, if you have afterflow, if you've shut in the well long enough, you might see a pressure flow regime in the pressures. So if you have a half slope, you might have a linear flow. If you have a unit slope, you have radial flow. And once you do, you can use the right time function, extrapolate it backwards, and get a sense of the pore pressure. So this is one of the plots. So mainly, we talked about minimum principal stress estimation. We talked about pore pressure estimation. Last step, permeability, right? For the permeability, it has three steps. Number one, you pick the data and equations to work with. Do you use pre-closure or post-closure? G function or H function, right? Then for post-closure, radial flow or linear flow. So each method has its own equations. So you're looking at quite a few permutations and combinations there. Then on the other hand, you have a fracture geometry that you need to make an assumption for. So radial fractures is the most common because that way you don't have to specify a height. So it'll make a pancake and assign that length to a radius. But if you don't want that, you need a PKN fracture or a rectangular fracture. You need a height so that you can effectively calculate the fracture half length. Okay. Now the equations for stiffness change depending on which geometry you're using. Okay. Then the last step, we basically run mass balance equations. So we can write that at 3 points at the end of injection at minimum DPDG where the fractures are fully open, or at peak DPDG where the fractures are fully closed, right? So now the total volume injected is known or measured in the DFIT test. So that's something we know that we're trying to target. And the way we do that is by writing a mass balance equation for volume that you injected should be equal to the volume in the fractures, should be equal to the wellbore storage that we lost some volume to, plus the volume that we leaked off. So a lot of balancing over there. And the idea is to basically find the combination of fracture extent and leak off rate that satisfy the same injected volume. Now, I've got some examples of non-ideal DFITs. I've also got some points where you would not run this analysis because you don't have a good response here. But effectively, in vertical wells, you might see a lesser dissipation compared to the horizontal wells, where you might see more dissipation. Okay. There's also a cheat sheet and a great blog post from ResFrac. So all of these different interpretations, all of the different permutation combinations, I think this is about 24 cases. But effectively what you get is a cheat sheet where, hey, if you have this situation and that situation, then should you estimate permeability or not? And how should you estimate it if so, right? Key takeaways. We'll jump back into this, but effectively it gets us an estimate of minimum principal stress, permeability, pore pressure. Depending on the G time or H time, you might have to add some more correction to the permeability that you get. But in effect, the post-closure permeability estimate is probably the best. And there's some more notes on where to avoid false radials and gas wells and stuff. But this is a great presentation that if you need more references, you can refer to. Or I have some more papers here that I definitely really like looking at. Okay. And now in the interest of time, maybe I might skip the demo, but let me run through the example and you don't have to follow along, but I'll just show you all the things that I might do for this one, right? So I've got a DFIT example. I've got production data. I've got all those pressures. I've got some injection rates. So you see classical shape. I've got some water injection. I've got some leak off and shut in. If I jump into the DFIT module, it'll automatically make some picks for me. One of them being where did I shut in my well, and hence how much cumulative volume did I inject. So if your rate data is not accurate, feel free to just enter that in here. It'll also pick the literal shut-in pressure, the pressure at which you shut the well in, and it'll also pick an initial pressure for you. And that's pretty much the pressure at which you started the test, right? The next thing you do is you select wellbore storage, or you identify the portion of the data where you can pick wellbore storage. You see pressure is increasing as you keep increasing the water, and that would be a good place to pick your wellbore storage, okay? Once you pick wellbore storage, you kind of run through the rest. Let me just fix the compressibility term here. I think I would use something like 13.6. I would leave the fluid viscosity to 1. Remember that the fluid viscosity that they're talking about here is effectively the viscosity of water, right? So you're looking at, this is a water injection test. That's why you would input water there. And you've got some rock properties in here. And all of the pre-closure methods you can pick from here. So if you assume a G time radial or PKN, or an H time radial or PKN, you pick all your pre-closure estimates from here, and you get a pre-closure permeability here. In terms of the post-closure, you see you want to look for afterflow. So I would add a half slope. And if that data or the derivative aligns with that half slope, I'm looking at a linear flow signature, okay? So if I have a linear flow signature, I pick impulse linear here, align this to the slope. And let me show you, I've had this request before where we do like to highlight the data that's clearly in linear flow. Okay, so let me just do that again. Oh, sorry, I think I was supposed to choose the pressure points. If that's the data, then that's the data I like. And you see all of those points get highlighted in my pore pressure plot, and I can use that to extend and extrapolate, getting a pore pressure of about 7,000. The pressure transient is moving into the reservoir, but effectively, I believe this fluid viscosity should represent the fluid moving into the reservoir. So in this test, since we used fresh water or pure water, we know the viscosity of that fresh water, and that's what makes it easier to calculate these parameters. But main moving pieces of the plot are your initial selections here. Then the next selection you'll make is this one. You watch for the S shape in the DPDG curve and pick the minimum. The software automatically adds that 10% rule of thumb and gets you the fracture contact pressure from 10% over that minimum DPDG. And then accordingly, you get to set your minimum principal stress. So you've got a minimum principal stress, high confidence, because you have this classical S shape. There are situations in which you may not have that S shape, and that's primarily your tortuosity and leak off kind of competing with each other, and you might see a monotonic decrease. But in this case, this is a high confidence estimate, so you can go ahead and use these permeability estimates that we've derived, right? So the H time radial, good assumption, post-closure permeability is using an impulse linear. I'm getting roughly about 2,500 to 3,000 nanodarcies, and that's where I would stop this test or this analysis. Make sense? You see, I have more resampling options. I can also go ahead and increase the number of points there. So you see, I have a linear resampling fraction of 1. I suddenly have more points here, and I can see all of the plots with more resolution. Can you adjust the start of the injection past the compression in the wellbore? Yeah, in any case, you're not using any of this data before you stop the injection. So effectively, you can definitely start the injection past the compression. Maybe the only thing you'll miss is probably the wellbore storage piece. But as long as you have a good estimate from other sources or from other tests, you can just add that value here, make sure the injected volume is the same and the characteristic rate is correctly identified. Because both the injected volume and the characteristic rate go into this injection duration calculation, and that calculates your G time, okay? In the new release, there would be a G times DPDG plot, just like this one. In this one, what we're using is, we're using this to pick the peak for the H time, and that gets used in the H time radial calculation. That's why you have this. And so if you move this, you'll see that your pre-closure permeability estimate changes with that, okay? But in the new release, you'll have a tangent method option here up top, and then you'll basically select that and use a tangent to this curve as a way to estimate the fracture contact pressure. Sure, it would end up with something like 8194. And let's say I were to put that in 8194, keep an eye on the permeabilities. So you see how those will suddenly go up now. Make sense? So a 200 psi difference or 200 psi difference in the fracture contact pressure could put you in a different spot in terms of permeability. And so that's what the authors really ask us to be warned about. And with that, I think I'm pretty much done with the training. I think I'll still hang out in the meeting just for some afterthoughts and any questions that folks may have. But I hope you really enjoyed and you have something to take away. Main things, just some references on the slides. Hopefully the slides capture most of the theory. Did the exercises, and if there's anything that you'd like to know more on this, feel free to reach out and we can set up a call and work through some of this. It's really interesting. And thank you for all the feedback. It's been phenomenal. It's been continuous improvement on our end as well. Super exciting to see that. Okay, so I have some questions in the chat. I'll just go from the top. And I think the first one that I did not get back on is, do you recommend a hard shut-in for the DFIT execution? If not, is the data still usable for ACA? Remind me, after closure analysis? Yeah, That's a good question. I think after closure, I think you might still be lucky with being able to analyze that. Hopefully you get this piece right in that scenario where you can still see the after closure and see how that has impacted that has changed. But I'm wondering if you don't have a hard shut-in, I wonder if the after closure impulse flow signatures will be hard to catch because they might be delayed, just like the closure as well. Does that make sense? And incorporate a flowback option for the DFIT FPA? Yes, I think that's still on the cards. This was definitely something we were super interested in doing. I think we were just ironing out some of the bugs and some of the feedback from this DFIT interpretation, and then we'll jump on to Chris Clarkson's DFIT FPA. Awesome. Yeah, I think there should be a recording that should be distributed. If there's anything that you missed, feel free to catch it over there. Feel free to bother me with questions because I really appreciate that. And I can probably get back to more people on email anyway. With the DFIT pore pressure estimates, is there a way to know whether an observed depletion is isolated at the toe or not? What's the degree of confidence that this can be a representative value for the entire lateral? That's a really good question, especially with the sizes of completion these days. I think that's a very good question in terms of where is this pore pressure relevant? Is that relevant at the heel or at the toe or things like that? But effectively, I think this, at least for the sake of the test, we're definitely measuring the permeability or the pore pressure as it relates to leak off from one fracture. So now the question is, where would you imagine that fracture be? So I guess if you have a plug and perf sort of a scenario, maybe it's more clear where you're measuring. But in case where you have an open hole or an open lateral, I think it might be closer to your shoe, wherever your casing shoe is or things like that. Very close to the heel, basically. Hope that makes sense, Chris. And Henry says, fluid viscosity of 1 results in a very high permeability. Is this an unconventional well? Yes, this should be an unconventional well. It should be an unconventional well, yeah. There's more to it, like in the sense that, let's say you went with a PKN assumption and then your fracture height was only about 30 feet, right? And in those cases, again, you would end up with a smaller permeability compared to H time radial, which would then give you a higher permeability. So there's few things that are going on in there that would kind of relate to fracture geometry that you assumed or the rock properties that you assumed. But yeah, definitely, I think we're getting really close in terms of those. Let me actually go double check on that, Henry. I'll go double check if this fluid viscosity is supposed to be the water viscosity or the reservoir fluid, because I know in the permeability calculations, we do need the reservoir fluid viscosity, but as far as I remember, that should be coming from the PVT. But I'll double check on the viscosity value there. Awesome. Thank you so much for attending. And if I've missed anyone on the chat, please feel free to email on chavali@whitson.com and I'll get back to you. Awesome. Pretty quickly. So thanks everyone. Bye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.